From quantum waves to digital circuits, the multifaceted genius of Johny von Neumann. Episode 1. Janos. Johny von Neumann was born into a world brimming with change. Budapest in 1903 was a dynamic hub of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place where intellectual debates mingled with the swirl of political aspirations and where ancient coffeehouses echoed with the chatter of poets, musicians, and scientists. His father, Neumann Mixer, Max Neumann, was a successful banker. His mother, Margit Kahn, came from a wealthy family as well. The world Johny entered would afford him comfort and an environment conducive to the nurturing of genius, though no one, not even his doting parents, could predict how far his singular mind would roam. From a very early age, Johny exhibited a prodigious memory and an uncanny gift for mathematics. Tales abounded of how he could, at the age of 6, exchange jokes in ancient Greek with his father's friends or mentally divide 8-digit numbers with astonishing rapidity. The Budapest of his childhood was a crucible of high culture and rigorous education, and his parents spared no expense. They invited private tutors who were themselves sometimes startled by the boy's intuitive leaps. He devoured mathematical puzzles like sweets, delighting in intricate geometry problems meant for far older students. Yet his fascination extended beyond numbers. He loved languages, reading, and history, which he treated with the same voracious curiosity he brought to math. Still, mathematics became the central axis around which his life would revolve. Even so, the domestic environment was not entirely defined by academic rigor. The Neumann household was known for splendid dinner gatherings, during which leading bankers, lawyers, and intellectuals of Budapest society convened. Young Johny was often allowed to stay up late, for his father took pride in his boy's charm and erudition. Thus, from an early stage, he was exposed to a kaleidoscope of ideas, heated political debates about the empire's future, and references to the great mathematicians of the age, such as David Hilbert in Göttingen or Henri Poincaré in Paris. These names, floating in the dinner conversations, took on an almost mythic aura in Johnny's imagination. In parallel with this privileged upbringing, the broader Hungarian context shaped him too. Budapest's golden age at the turn of the century was a time of rising national identity. The city merged a classical imperial heritage with modern urban growth, and young talents across the arts and sciences emerged like shooting stars. Yet, looming in the background were the tensions that would ultimately break apart the Austro-Hungarian Empire. World War I, beginning in 1914, would upend the region's stability. The aftermath of the war, combined with the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919 and subsequent political upheavals, led to anti-Semitic sentiments rising. The Neumann family, being Jewish, was acutely aware of shifting political tides. Johnny's father, sensitive to these developments, took steps to secure the family's status. He had been ennobled in 1913 by Emperor Franz Joseph, becoming Max von Neumann de Margita. But titles in a time of chaos proved brittle shields. Even so, the newly minted nobility status highlighted the family's upward mobility and contributed to Johnny's polished worldliness. Yet none of this overshadowed Johnny's pure, luminous fascination with mathematics. That was the real engine of his life. As the boy grew older, his mathematical gifts became more widely recognized. At the Fasori Gymnasium, one of Budapest's most rigorous high schools, he was placed under the tutelage of Laszlo Ratz, a legendary math teacher who had also taught other prodigies like the future Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner. Ratz quickly realized that Johnny's capabilities outstripped the normal curriculum. Before long, Johny was studying topics usually reserved for advanced university students. At the same time, he developed a fascination with set theory, a realm of mathematics that had begun to shake the foundations of the discipline, thanks in large part to Georg Cantor's revolutionary insights about infinity and David Hilbert's ambitious program to clarify the axiomatic underpinnings of mathematics. Hungary, it turns out, had a unique tradition in mathematics education, placing emphasis on problem-solving, creativity, and competition. Indeed, some of the future luminaries who emerged from Budapest, such as Paul Erdos, George Polya, Eugene Wigner, would later recollect an environment of intellectual playfulness, of forging original proofs and ingeniously tricky puzzle solutions. Johny von Neumann fit perfectly into that milieu, though even among such stellar minds he stood apart. By the time he was a teenager, Johnny was already conversant with some of the most abstract levels of mathematics, scribbling down ideas about logic and the nature of proof in the margins of his notebooks. He delighted in functional equations, in the subtle interplay of infinite sets, in the question of whether mathematics could be axiomatized completely. This latter question, driven by Hilbert's famous list of problems, would echo throughout Johnny's later work. Yet in his youth, these were mostly glimpses, sparks that illuminated his blossoming imagination. The world around him was not so carefree. The post-war collapse, inflation, and political uncertainty cast long shadows. Many Jewish families of means left Hungary for Western Europe or the United States in search of better prospects. Intellectuals from Budapest found themselves in Vienna, Berlin, or fleeing further afield. The newly formed Hungarian elite diaspora carried with it the seeds of an extraordinary contribution to Western science and culture, and Johnny would eventually become one of its most shining representatives. After finishing high school, Johnny considered his next moves. His father urged him toward a more practical profession. Banking or chemistry were possibilities. Indeed, Johnny initially enrolled in the University of Berlin to study chemical engineering, a compromise to appease his father's worries about the viability of a purely mathematical career. But mathematics, inevitably, remained his real passion. He took math courses on the side and soon found himself under the influence of Germany's greatest mathematicians. That he excelled in both disciplines was never in doubt. His curiosity was limitless. In Berlin, he haunted libraries and cafes, rummaging through newly published mathematical journals, studying the works of Hilbert, Courant, Weil, and other luminaries at Göttingen. He also dove into philosophical writings, particularly those of the Vienna Circle, and related movements exploring the logical structure of scientific theories. His agile mind craved a unifying logic behind it all. Mathematics, physics, philosophy, they were all threads in the same tapestry. This period overlapped with the frantic cultural atmosphere of Weimar Germany. Artistic innovation clashed with political radicalism. Jazz, Bauhaus architecture, and avant-garde expression filled the air. In academic circles, physics was undergoing a revolution as quantum mechanics burst onto the scene, and Einstein's general relativity had just challenged centuries of assumptions about space and time. The old order was dissolving, and new paradigms were forming. In such a crucible, Johnny found intellectual companions who would shape his trajectory. He first encountered the ideas of Kurt Gödel, a young Austrian logician working on the foundations of mathematics. Gödel's incompleteness theorems would, a few years later, deliver a seismic shock to Hilbert's program. Johnny was both intrigued and unsettled by the possibility that mathematics might harbor statements forever beyond its axiomatic derivability. It was a theme that would push Johnny to explore ever deeper into logic, computation, and the architecture of formal systems. During his Berlin years, Johnny also corresponded with other mathematicians who marveled at his brilliance. Rumors spread about this Hungarian wunderkind who could solve the hardest of problems with disarming ease. One anecdote from this time recounts a professor walking into a classroom only to find Johnny already at the blackboard, elaborating a proof that the professor himself was planning to lecture on. While it sounds apocryphal, it captures the spirit of Johnny's reputation as an unassuming yet unstoppable force of intellect. As the 1920s wore on, Johnny transferred to ETH Zurich for a time, continuing his chemical engineering studies while also publishing his first significant mathematics papers. By the age of 19, he had already contributed to the mathematical literature on set theory and was beginning to shape an approach that would become part of the bedrock of functional analysis. This area of mathematics, dealing with infinite dimensional vector spaces, would provide a language well suited to quantum mechanics, a subject that captured Johnny's imagination more and more. While still barely in his 20s, Johnny completed his doctoral degree in mathematics at the University of Budapest, though he barely attended physically as he was mostly in Berlin or Zurich with a thesis on set theory. The speed of his accomplishments dazzled even the seasoned mathematicians who examined him. A colleague later recalled that at Johnny's doctoral defense, it seemed the examiners were the ones being tested by the breadth of his knowledge. And so, at an age when most scholars are still carving out their academic path, Johny von Neumann was already recognized as a rising star in mathematical circles across Europe. He had absorbed the old traditions in rigorous Hungarian problem-solving and the modern approach of German formalism. His love of philosophy and logic would soon bring him into contact with leading thinkers such as Bertrand Russell and eventually a young English mathematician turned logician by the name of Alan Turing. Like many talented émigrés of his generation, Johnny sensed that the academic heart of Europe was fluttering dangerously. Political forces were gathering, and the Great Depression looming on the horizon would add economic misery to the stew of ideological ferment. Von Neumann, typically apolitical and devoted to pure thought, was not immune to the anxiety. Opportunities in the United States began to beckon. Even so, he would remain in Europe for a few more years, honing his mastery and forging relationships that would define the next era of his life. Yet in these heady early days, a distinct pattern emerged. Johny von Neumann was a polymath in the truest sense. He had a gift for bridging fields, for seeing structures that transcended disciplinary boundaries. Logic, set theory, geometry, chemistry, quantum physics all seemed mere stepping stones toward a grand edifice of unified understanding. That wide-ranging flair would become the hallmark of his legacy. Although the story of how he applied his gifts in the realm of computation, nuclear physics, and beyond was still in the future, the seeds were planted in Budapest's coffeehouses, in Berlin's lecture halls, in the hothouse of European intellectual life during the tumultuous 1920s. It was this confluence, his profound curiosity, his rigorous Hungarian training, his engagement with the epicenters of European thought, that shaped the young Johnny. He was playful, yet rigorous, sociable, yet deeply scholarly. There was an almost childlike delight when he encountered new ideas, and a fearsome intensity when he wrestled with complex theorems. While world events would soon demand that he turn his intellect to practical applications far removed from the contemplative quiet of academia, the bedrock of his genius was already in place. The boy who had once astonished dinner guests with feats of mental arithmetic was on the cusp of an era of discovery that would change the face of science forever. Thus ended the first chapter of his life, the forging of a mind unlike any the world had seen in the crucible of a Budapest and a Europe soon to be transformed by war, ideology, and exodus. Episode 2. The mid to late 1920s found Johny von Neumann in a flurry of intellectual activity. By now, he had progressed from a brilliant student to a mathematician gaining wide acclaim. His immersion in the rapidly evolving field of quantum mechanics became the single most pivotal shift in his early career. This science of the subatomic was in its infancy, with luminaries like Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and Paul Dirac grappling with strange and counterintuitive phenomena that defied classical logic. Von Neumann, for his part, approached quantum mechanics with the mindset of a mathematician who craved rigor. He believed that the subject needed a solid foundation, a strictly axiomatic presentation that could tame the weirdness of wave-particle duality, uncertainty, and probability. This mission would culminate in one of his most enduring achievements, the publication in 1932 of his magisterial treatise, Mathematische Grundlagen der Quantenmechanik, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. The genesis of that work began while he was visiting Göttingen, arguably the foremost center of mathematical physics in Europe at the time. There, David Hilbert held court as the grand patriarch of modern mathematics, while younger scholars like John Slater, Max Born, and Heisenberg flitted in and out, discussing the latest quantum breakthroughs. Von Neumann quickly became a central participant. Despite his youth, he asked incisive questions that left more senior physicists momentarily speechless. He saw the transformations of quantum states as linear operations in a Hilbert space, no pun intended, an insight that would unify the matrix mechanics of Heisenberg with the wave mechanics of Schrödinger. He famously introduced the concept of operators acting on these spaces, formalizing observables like momentum, position, energy as self-adjoint operators. These operators had eigenvalues that corresponded to the possible outcomes of measurements, and that entire framework spelled out the probabilities inherent in quantum experiments. Crucially, von Neumann's approach showed that the apparent dual formulations of quantum mechanics, Heisenberg's matrix mechanics and Schrödinger's wave equation, were mathematically equivalent. This was more than just housekeeping. It dispelled confusion and grounded the new physics in a robust, functional, analytic framework. Yet as he built these foundations, von Neumann was not purely an abstract theorist. He delved into philosophical debates about measurement and the so-called collapse of the wave function. The question of how and why a quantum system's wave function appeared to collapse into a definite outcome upon measurement vexed the greatest minds of that era, including Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. Von Neumann's perspective, now often referred to as the von Neumann chain, suggested that measurement could be interpreted as an interaction that entangles measuring apparatus and measured system, leaving open the question of when or if the wave function truly collapses. This line of thought would later influence the development of interpretations of quantum mechanics, from the Copenhagen stance to the many worlds approach, albeit well after von Neumann's time. These achievements unfolded against a backdrop of intense intellectual ferment. In the late 1920s, quantum mechanics was all the rage in academic circles. Conferences were held that brought together the brightest minds in physics. Von Neumann moved comfortably among them, forging friendships with the likes of Eugene Wigner, a fellow Hungarian who would later delve into nuclear physics and group theory, and once again impressing the older generation. Outside of pure physics, von Neumann kept up with developments in mathematical logic. He was closely following the drama of Hilbert's program, which aimed to provide mathematics with a complete and consistent set of axioms. This pursuit had spurred many to investigate the logical underpinnings of mathematics more deeply. That environment yielded the epical results of Kurt Gödel, who proved that any sufficiently rich axiomatic system contained statements that were true yet unprovable within the system. Gödel's 1931 incompleteness theorems delivered a shock to the mathematicians who had hoped for a final, perfect axiomatization. Von Neumann, upon understanding Gödel's result, famously recognized its importance immediately. It is said that he then abstained from pursuing a proof that he had been contemplating, realizing Gödel had already gone beyond it. Quantum mechanics, logical foundations, set theory. These were the pillars of von Neumann's early brilliance. Yet his personal life was also taking new shape. He married Mariette Covesi in 1930, and though the union would not last forever, they eventually divorced. The couple had a daughter, Marina, who would become an accomplished academic in her own right. By this time, Johny had accepted a visiting lectureship at Princeton University in the United States. This was a fateful move. His skill set, his Hungarian Jewish heritage, and the growing political tension in Germany all pointed him toward a transatlantic future. Indeed, Princeton in the early 1930s was the ideal landing spot for a young visionary mathematician. The newly created Institute for Advanced Study, IAS, was luring top-notch intellectuals from Europe, Einstein, Weil, Veblen, and eventually Gödel, among others, forming a potent community of world-class researchers. Von Neumann joined the Institute's first faculty in 1933, an astonishing distinction for someone only in his early 30s. In that bucolic setting, with minimal teaching requirements and few constraints, he could pursue research unfettered. Amid the blossoming of his quantum theory work, von Neumann kept one eye on the horizon of mathematical logic and the emerging concept of computation. In those years, a British mathematician named Alan Turing was producing revolutionary work on what would come to be known as the theory of computation. Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungs problem introduced the abstract notion of a Turing machine, effectively capturing the concept of algorithmic computation. Parallel to Turing, Alonzo Church was developing lambda calculus and the thesis that effectively formalized computable functions. Their results showed that Hilbert's hope for a mechanical procedure, an algorithm, to decide the truth of mathematical statements was impossible. This was a further blow to the completeness dream. Von Neumann, while not directly collaborating with Turing or Church at this stage, was absolutely fascinated by the implications. He recognized that the deeper questions of mathematics involved the nature of proof, the limits of mechanical computation, and the structure of formal systems. He encountered Turing personally when Turing spent some time at the Institute for Advanced Study. They discussed logic, cryptanalysis, which Turing would delve into during World War II, and even the possibilities of building actual computing machines. Such dialogues planted seeds in von Neumann's mind that would later flower into his landmark contributions to computer architecture. Meanwhile, quantum mechanics as a field kept raising new mysteries. Einstein famously sparred with Bohr about the theory's probabilistic worldview, culminating in the 1935 EPR paper, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen, which questioned whether quantum mechanics was truly complete. Von Neumann, from his vantage point, was less enthralled by philosophical conundrums about realism and more concerned with ensuring the mathematics was watertight. Still, he weighed in on the notion of hidden variables, writing a theorem that purported to show that deterministic hidden variables could not fully replicate the predictions of quantum mechanics, although later works by John Bell in 1964 showed that von Neumann's assumptions in that proof were restrictive. Nevertheless, von Neumann's theorem became a benchmark, illustrating how quantum theory, if correct, defied the local realism that Einstein cherished. These controversies played out in a broader historical context that grew darker by the year. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 heralded the transformation of Germany into a totalitarian regime. Anti-Semitic laws forced Jewish scholars out of universities. Many fled to the United States. Von Neumann, though he had already begun settling in Princeton, watched with dismay as the intellectual world he knew in Europe fractured under the weight of fascism. Friends and mentors were dispersed, and lines of inquiry were left incomplete. He felt relief and gratitude that the Institute for Advanced Study provided him with stable ground to continue his work. Yet the growing crisis in Europe, culminating in the outbreak of World War II in 1939, would soon demand the energies of scientists worldwide, von Neumann among them. Before that war would redirect his talents, the 1930s saw von Neumann forging a reputation as the ultimate theoretical polymath. He jumped from quantum theory to measure theory, from geometry to game theory, the seeds of which he planted in 1928 with a groundbreaking paper on the minimax theorem. Indeed, the introduction of game theory was yet another sign of his multifaceted genius. It was a field that aimed to analyze strategic interactions, how rational actors make decisions when outcomes depend on the actions of multiple participants. This line of thought sprang from a puzzle about poker and zero-sum games and would eventually transform economics, social sciences, and evolutionary biology. At the time, though, it was just another side project in the mind of von Neumann. There was, too, a sociable side to Johnny that belied the stereotype of a distant academic. He enjoyed parties, martinis, fast driving. He was known for his outrageous sense of humor and for occasionally showing up to events in flamboyant attire. Colleagues at the IAS recognized him as a convivial presence who could just as easily dominate a conversation about politics as he could discuss mathematical abstractions. He was also a chain smoker, often leaving half-finished cigarettes in every ashtray he passed. The comedic stories that circulated, like that of von Neumann crashing his car because he was too engrossed in a math problem, only served to enhance his legend. It's not entirely clear how many were apocryphal, but there's a consensus that he was, indeed, a larger-than-life personality. As the 1930s drew to a close, it was clear that von Neumann's capabilities were about to be harnessed in new and troubling ways. The dawn of World War II would shift the priorities of many scientists. While Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt in 1939 alerted the United States to the possibility of atomic weapons, it took years for the full research program, codenamed the Manhattan Project, to ramp up. Von Neumann, with his advanced knowledge of physics, mathematics, and a newly honed capacity for practical problem-solving, would prove indispensable. Yet even before official involvement in war work, he participated in discussions that shaped the direction of U.S. research. His skill at clarifying the mathematics of detonation waves, shock dynamics, and complex physical processes would become extremely valuable for the nuclear bomb's design. But at this point, in the late 1930s, that was still in the future. For now, Episode 2 ends with von Neumann at the height of his theoretical powers, having cemented foundational quantum mechanics, contributed to logic, hinted at the future of game theory, and found a home at the Institute for Advanced Study. The stage was set for him to pivot from pure theory to the demands of a world in conflict, bridging the gap between abstract brilliance and the stark realities of modern warfare. Episode 3. World War II erupted in 1939, and the United States entered the fray following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. For scientists like von Neumann, who had become naturalized American citizens, he took U.S. citizenship in 1937, the question was no longer whether to remain an aloof researcher, but how best to contribute to the war effort. Von Neumann's extraordinary mathematical gifts were quickly enlisted in various governmental projects. He began as a consultant for the U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory, analyzing the trajectories of artillery shells and bombs. This work may sound mundane to modern ears, but at the time it required advanced mathematics and computational heft. Calculating projectile paths in real-world conditions, taking into account air resistance, weather, and the explosive yields, was no trivial task. Von Neumann dove in with his characteristic enthusiasm, conjuring new approaches to partial differential equations and fluid dynamics. His incisive computations proved invaluable, and he earned a reputation among military brass for delivering results. Yet it was at Los Alamos, the clandestine site of the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, that von Neumann would make some of his most consequential wartime contributions. The Manhattan Project was a massive, secretive collaboration aimed at building an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could achieve the same. Under the leadership of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, Los Alamos gathered a constellation of scientific talent: Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, Niels Bohr, Hans Bethe, and many others. Von Neumann was a frequent visitor, not always in residence, but crucially present for certain analyses. His role involved the mathematics of implosion. The Manhattan Project's Fat Man bomb design hinged on compressing a sphere of plutonium into a supercritical mass by means of explosive lenses. This was an intricate engineering problem: how to arrange high explosives around the plutonium core so they would detonate in a precisely shaped shock wave that converged symmetrically. Von Neumann's deep knowledge of shock waves and hydrodynamics was essential. He devised the calculations that guided the design of the explosive lenses, ensuring the plutonium would be compressed uniformly to set off the nuclear chain reaction. Historians often note that von Neumann's invention of shaped charges and the theoretical underpinnings of implosion radically accelerated the bomb program. Alongside other mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, he refined the architecture of these explosive assemblies. His involvement was not merely theoretical, it had a direct bearing on the success of the world's first nuclear weapons test, known as Trinity, in July 1945, and ultimately on the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki the following month. Von Neumann, for his part, saw the war against the Axis powers as a dire struggle that necessitated extreme measures. He later expressed little regret about his involvement, believing that defeating Nazi Germany and then Imperial Japan was imperative, and that the rapid conclusion of the war would save lives in the aggregate. After the conflict ended, his expertise would remain pivotal in the subsequent nuclear arms race and the development of the more advanced hydrogen bomb. Meanwhile, the war also drove rapid progress in the realm of computation. Scientists at Los Alamos and other research centers were constantly faced with massive numerical problems, like simulating neutron diffusion in a nuclear explosion or modeling fluid dynamics for aircraft design. Mechanical calculators and human computers, rooms of people doing arithmetic by hand, were no longer up to the task. New devices like the Harvard Mark I and the ENIAC at the Moore School of Electrical Engineering in Philadelphia represented major leaps forward in automated calculation. Von Neumann quickly recognized their potential. A watershed moment arrived in 1944 to 45, when von Neumann was enlisted to help with computations on the ENIAC for the hydrogen bomb's feasibility. This put him in direct contact with engineers such as John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert, who had designed ENIAC, and with other mathematicians at the Moore School. Von Neumann immersed himself in how the machine functioned, its vacuum tube-based logic, the way it stored numbers, the laborious process of reconfiguring its switches and cables to execute a different program. In typical von Neumann style, he also devoured the theoretical underpinnings, drawing parallels to Turing's abstract concept of a universal computing machine. He soon grasped that the next generation of computers needed a revolutionary design, a stored program architecture where instructions and data resided in the same memory, allowing the machine to be reprogrammed by rewriting data instead of physically rewiring the hardware. This idea was in the air. Alan Turing had hinted at it. Others had considered it, but von Neumann was the one who popularized and formalized it in the famous first draft of a report on the EDVAC, written in 1945. Although the first draft was credited to von Neumann alone, it drew upon insights from Eckert, Mauchly, and other members of the group. Nevertheless, von Neumann's stature and clarity of exposition meant the report had an outsized impact, effectively shaping the design of the earliest modern computers like the EDVAC, EDSAC, and later the IAS machine at Princeton. Thus, the von Neumann architecture became a canonical reference for how computers should be structured: a control unit, arithmetic logic unit, memory that stored both instructions and data, and input-output mechanisms. This conceptual framework remains at the core of most computers to this day. During the same period, von Neumann's interactions with Claude Shannon, a young mathematician and electrical engineer who formulated information theory, further influenced the trajectory of digital computing. Shannon's seminal 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, laid the groundwork for quantifying information and dealing with signal transmission over noisy channels. Shannon and von Neumann exchanged ideas at Bell Labs and Princeton, exploring the boundaries between computing, logic, and communication. Although their direct collaborations were limited, there's no doubt they inspired each other. Shannon admired von Neumann's brilliance, while von Neumann recognized the revolutionary potential of Shannon's approach to encoding and transmitting data. All of this activity was set against the ongoing global conflict, and by 1945, its aftermath. The dropping of atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945 brought the war to a brutal close, ushering in the nuclear age. As a result, the United States and the Soviet Union embarked on an arms race whose chilling logic would come to dominate the post-war world. Von Neumann found himself increasingly involved in policy discussions about nuclear strategy. His wide-ranging mind, once purely fixated on mathematics, was now delving into game-theoretic concepts of deterrence and the structure of geopolitics. At the Institute for Advanced Study, as the war ended and the immediate crisis receded, the question became how to harness these new computational technologies for scientific research in peacetime. Von Neumann took a leading role. He advocated for building a computer at the IAS, a state-of-the-art machine that would push forward mathematical physics, weather modeling, and more. Alan Turing spent time at the IAS around 1947, albeit briefly, and left a lasting impression. Turing was working on the concept of artificial intelligence, while von Neumann was focusing on how to physically implement a universal machine at scale. The synergy between their visions was palpable, although Turing's time in America was short, and they never fully combined forces on a single project. But von Neumann pressed on. By the late 1940s, the IAS machine, often simply called the IAS computer or Johnny's computer, was under construction. It integrated the stored program model, binary arithmetic, random access memory, and other innovations. Brilliant engineers like Julian Bigelow helped von Neumann transform theoretical blueprints into a tangible electronic calculator. The project faced numerous technical hurdles. Vacuum tubes were delicate and prone to burning out, memory was limited, and debugging was a daily ordeal. But it was a landmark achievement. Many pioneering computer scientists, including John Backus, who later developed Fortran, and John McCarthy, the father of Lisp and AI, would be influenced by the design. Around this time, von Neumann's second marriage took place. He married Clara Dan in 1938, a companion who shared aspects of his social lifestyle and who would later help him with computational tasks. Together they traveled between Princeton, Los Alamos, and Washington, D.C., forging the shape of post-war science policy. In person, Johnny was a whirlwind of ideas. He often juggled half a dozen intense discussions with colleagues and reported to the Pentagon as a consultant on defense strategies. Though he had an endearing manner, full of jokes and entertaining stories, he was also steely in his strategic outlook. His involvement in nuclear weapons design was unwavering. Some have suggested that von Neumann's stance on nuclear weapons verged on hawkish, that he believed in the principle of deterrence through overwhelming force. This conviction, tied to the logic of game theory, would guide American Cold War policies for decades. Indeed, the concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, while never solely due to von Neumann, bore the imprint of game-theoretic reasoning that he helped popularize. He seemed to believe that rational actors would avoid nuclear war only if the threat of retaliation was absolute. It was a grim calculus, but it underpinned U.S. policy throughout the era of ballistic missiles and hydrogen bombs. Meanwhile, the synergy between computing and physics that the war had fostered didn't abate in peacetime. Von Neumann foresaw that computers could revolutionize everything from weather prediction. He was an early advocate of numerical weather modeling to economics, cryptography, and biology. He embarked on a quest to understand complex automata, delving into the question of how machines, and perhaps living organisms, could reproduce themselves. This project would yield the first formulations of what came to be called cellular automata, which later influenced the likes of Stephen Wolfram and artificial life research. Even though this line of inquiry was overshadowed by his other commitments, it underscored his capacity to see well beyond the horizon of existing science. It was in the mid to late 1940s that von Neumann's renown became truly global. He was no longer just a mathematician's mathematician. He was a central figure in America's scientific establishment. He received prestigious awards, gave keynote lectures, and was invited to serve on committees that shaped federal funding for research. Colleagues marveled at how quickly and fluidly he could shift from an esoteric conversation about operator algebras to a briefing about ballistic missiles. This range would define the post-war Renaissance man, but few approached his depth in each subject. By 1950, the world had changed profoundly from the one he had known in Budapest. The US and the Soviet Union were locked in the early stages of the Cold War, each brandishing nuclear arsenals. Europe lay in ruins, rebuilding under the Marshall Plan. The exuberance of pure science that had characterized the 1920s was replaced by a more sober awareness of how knowledge could be harnessed for devastation or for deterrence. Von Neumann, at the center of this new reality, straddled the line between championing open scientific inquiry and fortifying the national defense. Over the next years, He would refine those dual roles still further, culminating in a final burst of discoveries before illness cut his life short. For now, Episode 3 draws to a close with the war's end and the dawn of modern computing. Von Neumann had come through the crucible of world conflict with his energies not only intact, but multiplied. The Manhattan Project, the ENIAC, the stored program computer design, these had given him a taste of harnessing mathematics for concrete objectives, from the lethal to the enlightening. In the next phase of his life, he would apply those insights even more broadly, laying the groundwork for an entire ecosystem of research, from game theory to self-replicating automata that continues to shape our age. Episode 4. With the war over and nuclear tensions rising, the years from the late 1940s to the early 1950s saw Johny von Neumann become enmeshed in the highest levels of U.S. science policy. He took on a position at the Atomic Energy Commission, advised the Department of Defense, and served on committees that bridged academic research and government strategy. The United States was quickly transitioning from atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear devices, and von Neumann's strategic mind, combined with his knowledge of nuclear physics, made him indispensable. During this period, the race to develop the hydrogen bomb, intensified. Edward Teller, another Hungarian-American physicist, spearheaded the push, though progress was initially slow. Teller's early designs had run into theoretical and engineering challenges. Von Neumann stepped in, offering fresh computational insights and alternative approaches to compression and ignition. Using the computational resources at Los Alamos and the brand-new machines being built at other labs, he led the theoretical charge on simulating thermonuclear reactions. Those simulations, while rudimentary by modern standards, were instrumental in refining the design that would ultimately become the Teller-Ulam configuration, tested in 1952. The moral quandaries that accompanied such developments rarely found comfortable resolution in von Neumann. By most accounts, he was resolute that the United States needed to maintain a strategic lead. He reasoned that the Soviet Union, having acquired nuclear capability by 1949, would soon pursue thermonuclear weapons of its own. To deter a totalitarian regime, the US needed to project overwhelming strength. This logic dovetailed with his deepening interest in game theory, a field he had pioneered 2 decades earlier, now coming to fruition in new contexts. Game theory, developed in collaboration with economist Oscar Morgenstern, achieved a grand exposition in the 1944 book Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. Although the initial impetus for von Neumann's interest lay in parlor games like poker, he quickly saw applications to economic markets and, more ominously, to international conflict. The concept of a zero-sum game resonated with the idea that the gain of one nuclear superpower was a loss to the other, fostering an unstable equilibrium. Von Neumann's minimax theorem, which states that in certain zero-sum games there exists an equilibrium strategy for both players, found chilling echoes in the logic of nuclear deterrence. At the same time, he recognized that not all conflicts were strictly zero-sum. Coalitions, alliances, negotiation, these required the expansion of game theory into cooperative games. But the public imagination seized upon the notion of rational actors jockeying for advantage in a nuclear standoff, analyzing payoffs in a mutual assured destruction scenario. Although the full articulation of MAD was a product of various thinkers in the 1950s and 1960s, von Neumann's earlier insights about equilibrium strategies provided one conceptual framework that shaped it. His conviction that rational analysis could guide policy was in keeping with the scientific spirit of the age, albeit it often seemed to oversimplify the messy, psychological aspects of real-world diplomacy. Beyond nuclear strategy, the synergy of computing and mathematics continued apace in von Neumann's work. His computer project at the Institute for Advanced Study became operational around 1951, featuring a memory of about 1,024 words and an operating speed that, by today's standards, seems quaint, yet it was revolutionary for the time. Von Neumann and his team used it for partial differential equations, meteorological models, and other advanced computations. The field of numerical weather prediction, in particular, gained from von Neumann's determination to systematically model atmospheric dynamics. He believed that understanding the complex interplay of wind, pressure, and temperature would lead not only to better forecasts, but perhaps even to weather control. While that latter ambition remains elusive, his impetus spurred the modern science of climate and atmospheric modeling. In parallel, he ventured into the theory of automata. The question that seized his imagination was how complex organisms, such as cells, could replicate themselves, and whether the principle of self-replication could be captured in a discrete mathematical model. Alan Turing had already touched on morphogenesis in biological systems, exploring how patterns in nature, like a zebra's stripes, might arise from reaction diffusion equations. Von Neumann took a different tack, pondering how a machine could read its own description and build a copy of itself. Working with the mathematician Arthur Burks, he formulated a theoretical model that used a cellular automaton, a grid of cells, each in a finite number of states, evolving step by step according to fixed rules. Von Neumann's design showed that, in principle, a universal constructor could exist within such a grid, creating a new machine identical to itself. This was decades before John Conway's Game of Life would popularize cellular automata for a wider audience. Von Neumann's interest in the subject was deeply connected to questions of computation, complexity, and biology. He saw parallels between genes encoding the structure of an organism and programs encoding the behavior of a machine. Though these ideas were overshadowed by his other, more defense-oriented work, they would, in time, influence the emergence of fields like artificial life and complex systems research. Meanwhile, on the sociological front, von Neumann became a public figure. He testified before congressional committees, wrote policy papers, and advised presidents. The press portrayed him as the archetype of the brilliant scientist working for the nation's security. His personal life also underwent changes. His second marriage to Clara Dan was outwardly stable, though his frenetic schedule meant he was often away from home. Despite his heavy workload, he found time for a social life filled with dinner parties and lively conversation. The flamboyant side of his personality, driving Cadillacs too fast, telling raucous jokes, remained intact, though some noted a certain weariness creeping in as the 1950s progressed. His old friends from the Manhattan Project days, such as Richard Feynman, Eugene Wigner, and Hans Bethe, also occupied key roles in the post-war scientific landscape. Many shared a sense of relief that Nazism had been vanquished, but they remained uneasy about the budding arms race. Einstein, who famously lamented his role in encouraging the development of the atomic bomb, espoused a more pacifistic stance. Von Neumann, while never glib about the dangers, justified nuclear build-ups through rational game-theoretic arguments. This philosophical divergence became a microcosm of larger debates within the scientific community. In 1953, the hydrogen bomb's successful test by the United States, followed soon after by the Soviet Union's own test, cemented the terrifying new status quo of thermonuclear standoff. Von Neumann's calculations had played a part in that achievement, and he remained a key figure in the continuing refinement of nuclear weapons, which now moved toward missile delivery systems. He occasionally visited Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, a think tank that employed many game theorists and mathematicians working on strategic studies. There, personalities such as Hermann Kahn and later Thomas Schelling would expand upon von Neumann's initial game-theoretic insights, forging the bedrock of Cold War nuclear strategy. Even as he straddled these worlds of research and policy, von Neumann carried on his mathematical investigations. He continued to study operator algebras, an outgrowth of his quantum mechanics work, and looked at new problems in logic. The synergy of abstract theory and practical application in his life was unparalleled. He seemed equally at home pondering the continuum hypothesis in set theory or drafting a report on ballistic missile defense. Stories from this time suggest that he could attend a day's worth of classified briefings on nuclear designs, then saunter into the Institute for Advanced Study Library and devour a set of new papers on pure math. His restless intellect knew no boundary between pure and applied. In the broader cultural sphere of the 1950s, the United States was riding a wave of post-war prosperity. Suburbia expanded, television began to reshape entertainment, and the specter of Soviet aggression loomed large in the public's consciousness. Von Neumann, with his thick Hungarian accent and boundless brilliance, stood out as both a product of American opportunity and a symbol of the European intellectual tradition transplanted overseas. While the average citizen might not have understood the intricacies of his mathematics, he had become a fixture of the scientific establishment, part of a pantheon that included Einstein and Oppenheimer, figures who shaped national destiny at the intersection of science and politics. It was not all triumph, however. By 1955, von Neumann began to show signs of ill health. Initially, it was dismissed as exhaustion, but tests eventually revealed that he had cancer, likely bone or pancreatic cancer. Accounts differ. It progressed rapidly, and for the first time, the unstoppable force seemed mortal. Colleagues noticed him losing weight, and his usual buoyancy was tempered. He began undergoing painful treatments. Yet, even in his hospital bed, he continued working, scribbling notes on game theory, discussing computer designs, guiding his aides on a new round of calculations. In the final years of his life, while his body weakened, von Neumann's mind burned as brightly as ever. He accepted the presidency of the American Mathematical Society and received the Enrico Fermi Award in 1956 for his outstanding contributions to nuclear energy. Even as he lay in Walter Reed Army Medical Center, he engaged in spirited debates with visiting scientists. By this time, he had also embraced Catholicism, a move that puzzled some of his friends, though it may have been influenced by personal reflections on mortality or perhaps by his second wife's faith. The swirl of visits, honors, and last-ditch treatments characterized his final months. He continued to consult with the Defense Department, drafting what would be among his last memoranda on ballistic missile defense. Some of his colleagues found the spectacle heartbreaking. A man revered for his mental powers, confined to a hospital bed, was still bridging the gap between the corridors of power and the halls of pure intellect. Finally, on February 8, 1957, Johny von Neumann died, leaving behind an enduring legacy that spanned mathematics, physics, computer science, and the existential logic of nuclear war. Episode 4 thus ends on a poignant note. The man who had done so much to shape both the architecture of modern computing and the thermonuclear standoff passed away just as the world he helped create was coming into its own. The arms race would spiral on without him, and the emerging digital revolution would amplify and extend the ideas he had championed. Across these vast domains, von Neumann's imprint endured. Episode 5. To understand Johny von Neumann's influence on computation, one must step back and see the grand arc of computing's evolution. From Turing's abstract machines in the mid-1930s to the flurry of wartime research on ENIAC, from the first draft of a report on the EDVAC to the building of the IAS machine. These developments pointed humanity toward the digital age. If one had to pinpoint a single conceptual leap that stands above the rest, it was the recognition of the stored program principle. And von Neumann, more than any single individual, was responsible for embedding that idea in the consciousness of engineers and scientists worldwide. But the story does not end at the blueprint stage. As the 1950s progressed, numerous projects sprung up at Manchester, Cambridge, MIT, and IBM, each building upon or parallel to von Neumann's architecture. The widespread adoption of binary representation, random access memory, and sequential instruction execution was not guaranteed at the outset, but von Neumann's arguments for their efficiency and simplicity proved compelling. The result was a kind of standard model for the next generation of computers. Meanwhile, a younger crop of mathematicians and engineers, many of whom had served under von Neumann at Princeton or worked alongside him in government contracts, took his ideas further. John Backus at IBM started pioneering high-level programming languages, culminating in Fortran, 1957. This allowed programmers to write instructions in an algebraic form rather than direct machine code. John McCarthy, influenced by both Turing's logic and von Neumann's machines, began exploring artificial intelligence and would later create Lisp, 1958. The synergy was clear. The stored program concept allowed for more flexible software, which in turn accelerated the exploration of advanced algorithms and data structures. In the realm of complexity theory, the study of how computational resources scale with problem size, von Neumann's seminal insights provided a starting point. He had speculated about the limits of computation, about whether parallel architectures might outstrip the conventional sequential model, and about the possibility of harnessing random processes in computation, an early hint of what would become probabilistic algorithms. While these lines of inquiry would mature decades later, they were seeded by von Neumann's wide-ranging mind. Similarly, in the field of cybernetics, championed by Norbert Wiener, the notion of feedback and control in machines resonated with von Neumann's thinking on self-replicating automata. Wiener's work bridged statistics, engineering, and biology to formulate the concept of control systems governed by feedback loops. Von Neumann, while never fully embracing Wiener's overarching vision, shared his interest in interdisciplinary synthesis, particularly in the interplay between computation, biology, and cognition. Yet for all his involvement with high-level design, von Neumann was also known for his hands-on approach when a practical problem caught his imagination. At Los Alamos, he would often ride the circuit between programmers and physicists, helping them refine code, interpret results, and debug hardware. His ability to jump into the nitty-gritty while also seeing the grand conceptual framework was legendary. He understood that the success of computational projects depended as much on engineering details, reliability of vacuum tubes, memory access times, numerical stability of algorithms, as on the lofty vision of a universal machine. Outside of the United States, the nascent Soviet computer program watched these developments with keen interest. Scientists like Sergei Lebedev in Moscow built early computers that, while not direct copies, were influenced by the same von Neumann architecture. In Britain, Maurice Wilkes at Cambridge led the EDSAC project, arguably the first practical stored program computer to run a routine operation in 1949. Wilkes credited von Neumann's EDVAC report for clarifying the approach. By the mid-1950s, a new generation of machines was appearing across universities and research labs on both sides of the Atlantic, each carrying forward the design principles that had become a near-universal standard. The consequence of this proliferation was profound. Computational power began to insinuate itself into areas that had previously relied on hand calculation or rudimentary mechanical aids. Physics, engineering, meteorology, economics, biology, all began to harness digital simulations and data processing. While the computers were still huge, temperamental, and extremely limited by modern standards, they signaled a shift in how science was conducted. Von Neumann saw with crystalline clarity that these machines would not only tackle existing problems more efficiently, but would open up entirely new questions that were previously unapproachable. Indeed, in a 1949 letter, von Neumann spoke of the computer as an experimental laboratory for mathematics, enabling explorations of nonlinear systems and complicated integrals that defied closed-form solutions. This experimental mathematics would later evolve into a robust field, aided by the exponential growth of computing power. Even fractal geometry, chaos theory, and advanced number theory would eventually benefit from computational experiments that validated or disproved conjectures. Meanwhile, the sociological dimension of computing was equally significant. Governments and corporations soon realized that these machines could be applied to business record-keeping, census data, cryptanalysis, and, of course, military logistics. The seeds of modern information technology were planted, and by the 1960s, the so-called mainframe era would be in full swing, culminating in the subsequent personal computer revolution. While von Neumann did not live to see the integrated circuit or the microprocessor, his fundamental design principles scaled neatly into those technologies. The acronym CPU, Central Processing Unit, and the concept of memory-mapped I/O remain direct descendants of his architecture. Turning to the theoretical underpinnings, von Neumann's interactions with Alan Turing remain a fascinating what-if of scientific history. Turing, after his code-breaking feats at Bletchley Park, spent time at the National Physical Laboratory, NPL, in London, proposing the ACE, Automatic Computing Engine, which also adopted a stored program design. He visited the Institute for Advanced Study briefly, but the two geniuses never fully collaborated. Had they spent more time cross-pollinating, the theoretical landscape of computation might have evolved even faster. As it was, Turing returned to England, continued his mathematical explorations, and tragically died in 1954. Von Neumann passed away 3 years later. In that narrow window, though, they planted seeds that would define the next half-century of computing. Another figure of note was Alonzo Church, who, like Turing, formulated a definition of computability. Church's lambda calculus proved equivalent to Turing's machines in expressing what we now call the Church-Turing thesis. Von Neumann, well versed in logic and set theory, appreciated the significance of these findings. Yet he focused more on bridging the gap between abstract computation and concrete machines. The synergy between Church's theoretical foundation and von Neumann's practical architecture became the bedrock of modern computer science curricula. One can see the imprint of both men in the typical layout of an undergraduate CS course. First, the theoretical models of computation, then the hardware architecture, all culminating in the design of real software systems. Through all this progress, von Neumann maintained a voracious appetite for new challenges. He recognized the potential for applying computing to biological phenomena, something that would only truly take off decades later with the arrival of computational genomics and systems biology. His idea that the logic of self-reproduction could be abstracted into a cellular automaton was a vision far ahead of its time. Only in the 1970s and beyond would researchers like John Conway, Christopher Langton, and Stephen Wolfram bring it into wider popular and academic consciousness. In the immediate wake of his death, colleagues at the Institute for Advanced Study continued to refine the IAS machine, while other labs adapted the design for specialized scientific computing. The arms race also continued to escalate as ballistic missile technology advanced to carry nuclear payloads. Some of these developments, such as the early designs of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were underpinned by the very same shockwave and fluid dynamics computations von Neumann had perfected. Indeed, the synergy between advanced computing and advanced weaponry proved a hallmark of the Cold War. While the moral ramifications were complex, the impetus for computational innovation was undeniable. Funds poured in, ensuring that the nascent computing industry grew rapidly. By the late 1950s, the shape of modern computing was becoming clearer. Magnetic core memory replaced more finicky electrostatic tube memory. Transistors were starting to replace vacuum tubes. IBM rose to dominance in the commercial sphere, selling large-scale systems to corporations and universities. Each step of this evolution built upon the foundation that von Neumann had championed: a single memory for data and program instructions, a CPU to fetch and execute instructions in sequence, and an input-output system to feed the machine and retrieve results. Optional variations, parallelism, different memory hierarchies emerged, but the essential blueprint remained the same. Thus, Episode 5 can be seen as the story of how von Neumann's architectural vision permeated the world. Though overshadowed in popular history by dramatic wartime events and the looming specter of nuclear annihilation, it is no exaggeration to say that the digital revolution pivoted on those early designs. Without them, the pace of progress in computing would have been slower and less cohesive. The stage is now set for the final episode. How von Neumann's grand tapestry, spanning quantum theory, mathematics, nuclear strategy, computation, and beyond, culminated in his final days and continued to reverberate after his passing, shaping the latter half of the 20th century, and indeed the 21st. Episode 6. In his final years, Johny von Neumann was, in many ways, at the apex of his career. He was recognized globally as a polymath who had shaped modern science. His involvement in the Manhattan Project, his leadership in designing the first modern computers, his forays into game theory, and his foundational work in mathematics and quantum mechanics were unparalleled in their reach. Yet the shadow of illness darkened his life from 1955 onward. Cancer, inexorable and cruel, spread through his body, confining him to a hospital bed for long stretches at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Despite immense pain and the gradual loss of mobility, he insisted on continuing his work. He met with government officials and scientific colleagues in his hospital room, dictating notes, scribbling formulas, and reviewing drafts of policy recommendations. Visitors reported that while his body was frail, his mind remained astonishingly sharp. He could still engage in lightning-quick mental calculations, and his humor, though subdued, still surfaced in flashes. Some said that he would even entertain the medical staff with wry anecdotes about Hungarian folklore or quotes from classic literature. During this period, his reflections took on a more existential quality. He formally converted to Catholicism, leading to speculation about his motivations, fear of death, an attempt at spiritual reconciliation, or simply a nod to the faith of those close to him. Whatever the reasons, it was a poignant turn for a man whose life had been so deeply rooted in logical and empirical reasoning. That said, he never publicly disavowed his scientific stance, and he continued to champion the rational analysis of policy decisions, including the expansion of U.S. nuclear capability. On February 8, 1957, Johny von Neumann passed away at the age of 53. His loss was deeply felt in the scientific community. Newspapers eulogized him as a giant of mathematics and the father of the modern computer. The funeral drew prominent figures from government and academia alike. The Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton held memorial lectures in his honor. Albert Einstein, who would die just 2 years later, was said to be visibly shaken. The two men, while not intimate friends, had shared a deep mutual respect and had often strolled the grounds of the IAS discussing physics, mathematics, and the unsettled state of the world. In the months and years after his passing, the full measure of von Neumann's legacy began to crystallize. Projects he had set in motion carried on. The IAS machine continued operating and inspiring new computational designs. Game theory developed into a standard tool in economics and political science. Operator algebras advanced under the guidance of successors like F.J. Murray and others. His quantum mechanical formalisms remained fundamental to physicists worldwide, and of course, the nuclear strategies he helped develop continued to shape the tense standoff of the Cold War. For many, the moral ambivalence of his involvement in nuclear weapons overshadowed the brilliance of his mathematics. Critics argued that he had been too cavalier about the ethical implications of the arms race. Others, including some of his closest colleagues, defended him, noting the horrors of totalitarian regimes and the necessity of deterrence. The truth is likely more complicated. Von Neumann was a product of his time, deeply influenced by the desperation of World War II and the existential threat of the Soviet Union. Yet these debates would echo for decades, illuminating the uneasy relationship between scientific progress and global security. In the scientific realm, the depth and range of von Neumann's mind became ever more apparent as new fields emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. Cellular automata, which he had pioneered, blossomed into a subfield of complexity science. Researchers began to see in these discrete models a microcosm of self-organization, emergent behavior, and even the rudiments of artificial intelligence. John Conway's Game of Life, introduced in 1970, captured public imagination, but the underlying conceptual framework owed much to von Neumann's earlier work. Scholars writing on the history of cellular automata often place von Neumann at the roots of the discipline, along with Stanislaw Ulam, who had also been a colleague at Los Alamos. Game theory, meanwhile, took on a life of its own in economics. The Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences was awarded to game theorists such as John Nash, Reinhard Selten, and John Harsanyi for their refinements and extensions of the field. Von Neumann's Minimax solution concept and his collaborative book with Morgenstern laid the early groundwork, and his emphasis on rigorous axiomatic structure resonated with generations of economists. He had shown that mathematics could tackle the murky domain of strategic behavior, anticipating the wave of analytical modeling that would dominate social science in the late 20th century. As for computing, the exponential growth in hardware performance, often captured by Moore's law, turned von Neumann's architecture into the backbone of an emerging digital society. By the 1970s, microprocessors shrank entire computers onto a single chip, but the logical arrangement of CPU, memory, and data bus still followed von Neumann's blueprint. When personal computers emerged in the 1980s, they, too, were von Neumann machines at heart. Even the smartphones of the 21st century carry forward that architectural DNA. Alternative architectures, such as parallel and neural network designs, have gained traction, but none have fully displaced the fundamental standard he established. In mathematics proper, von Neumann's name remains inscribed in multiple theorems, lemmas, and definitions. The von Neumann algebras in functional analysis, the von Neumann universe in set theory, the Birkhoff-von Neumann theorem in matrix theory, and so on. His style, combining abstract rigor with an uncanny ability to see the broader implications, became a model for future generations of mathematicians. He gave impetus to non-commutative geometry, a field that would later be championed by Alain Connes, among others. Even beyond the purely technical, the myth of von Neumann endures in scientific folklore. Stories of his photographic memory, his lightning-fast mental calculations, his perpetual good humor and social flair, his unstoppable curiosity, they paint a portrait of a man whose intellect was as expansive as it was deep. Some recall his delight in telling jokes in multiple languages, others his capacity to drink copious amounts of strong liquor without diminishing his mental acuity. These anecdotes, passed down through generations of students and colleagues, cemented his reputation as a once-in-a-century genius, perhaps on par with the likes of Leonhard Euler in terms of breadth or Gauss in terms of raw power. Sociologically, von Neumann represented a wave of European émigré intellectuals, many of them Jewish, who fled the turmoil of the 1930s and 1940s to reshape American scientific and cultural life. That cohort included Edward Teller, Eugene Wigner, Leo Szilard, and many more. They brought with them the rigorous traditions of European mathematics and physics, merging them with American dynamism and resources. The result was a golden age for U.S. science, particularly in the post-war decades. Von Neumann's early upbringing in the creative, problem-solving climate of Hungarian mathematics played no small part in forging his extraordinary abilities. Now, as the 21st century advances, the domains von Neumann touched continue to evolve. Quantum computing, for instance, stands on the shoulders of the formalism he helped establish for quantum mechanics. Researchers exploring quantum information make daily use of operator theory and Hilbert space structures that von Neumann so carefully laid out. Artificial intelligence, shaped by both Turing's theoretical insights and von Neumann's architectural designs, is reaching new heights with machine learning, though it increasingly probes beyond the classic von Neumann bottleneck. Even the engineering of advanced microchips references back to his principles, although attempts to move toward neuromorphic or massively parallel architectures hint at the possibility of a post-von Neumann era. Yet if we step back to measure the totality of his life and work, we might see von Neumann not merely as the father of a particular architecture or a single theorem, but as a catalytic force who merged distinct intellectual currents. He took the foundational rigor of mathematics, the new paradigms of quantum physics, the strategic demands of wartime engineering, and the incipient field of digital computation, and molded them into a cohesive worldview. He believed fervently that precise mathematical thinking could tackle the most monumental problems, whether it be designing bombs of unparalleled destructive power or unraveling the complexities of the human brain. His passing at a relatively young age left many wondering what further breakthroughs he might have contributed had he lived another decade or two. Would he have turned his formidable intellect to genetics, to the exploration of space, to advanced AI? Would he have revisited the philosophical questions of quantum measurement that still tantalize theorists? We can only speculate. What is certain is that the path he helped blaze has been followed by countless others, each building on his frameworks, each inspired by his unwavering belief in the power of reason. In a sense, the von Neumann story mirrors the story of 20th century science itself. From the parlor games of theoretical mathematics in old Europe to the forging of nuclear weapons and the harnessing of digital computation in the New World, culminating in an age shaped by code, data, and unprecedented possibilities and risks. Von Neumann stood at the nexus of that transformation, epitomizing both the wonders and the anxieties of modernity. And so ends our journey through his life, told in 6 episodes that traverse the forging of a prodigious intellect in Budapest, the grand expansions of knowledge in quantum mechanics, the crucible of the Manhattan Project, the revolution of digital computing, and the final summation of a legacy that spans continents and disciplines. Johny von Neumann was a mathematician, a physicist, an engineer of strategy, and a pioneer of computation. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph is that he never saw a boundary he was unwilling to cross. For him, the world was one vast puzzle, waiting to be solved with the right combination of imagination, rigor, and boldness. His life, though cut short, stands as a testament to the power of ideas to reshape civilizations, for good or ill. And in that, he remains one of the most profoundly influential scientific figures of the modern era, a man whose footprints are visible at the very foundations of how we compute, how we strategize, and how we interrogate the deepest structures of reality.